Well, greetings, vinyl community. I'm here today to do a recap of my vinyl finds for the month of January. And I'm going to start with a record that I actually have already shown once because it was in the vinyl tag, and it was the answer to the question, show a record that you haven't listened to yet. Well, I've listened to it now, and it is Heliocentric Worlds of Sun Ra, Volume 2 on the ESP label. And it seems that there were three different mixes of this album, one with African tribal voices heard throughout side A, a side-long piece, and also all of these original copies. This is not an original. This is best guess, I think, from about 1970 or early 70s. Discogs just shows it as unknown, but it's not a first pressing. In any event, the first version has the African voices clearly audible throughout the side. The second version has them mixed down, so they're only audible at the beginning and end, and maybe at the quieter bits throughout the piece. And the third version, which is the one generally used for modern-day reissues, has them mixed out entirely. Well, this is the second version that has the voices present but mixed down. So that's what I learned upon listening to the album for the first time. Entering the world of prog rock, this is Happy the Man, a great band from Virginia. Their name is shared with the title of a Genesis song, but that's pure coincidence. That just happened to be something that was floating around in the prog rock zeitgeist of the 70s. This is the second Happy the Man album, the last they did with the originally. There are some issues of archival music that came out later in a reunion thing, but this was the second and last album from 1978, Crafty Hands. And this is almost entirely instrumental. They had two or three vocal pieces at least on their first album. This one is almost entirely instrumental. Great stuff. Very, very much in the slightly fusion-y but very prog vein. Very rewarding listening if you're into the classic prog sound of the 70s. Another prog band, this one from Canada, is Monish, and these guys have a very classical sound, a lot of woodwinds and keyboards, a lot of piano, I should say. Again, it's all instrumental except for one track with vocals. Very light and melodic, very enjoyable, very pretty. They do use a lot of tuned percussion, not so much on this album, which is titled Les Porches. The follow-up, Ni Vent Ni Nouvelle, had a much more prominent role for tuned percussion, which gave it a little bit of a Zappa air, but not the kind of prickly side of Zappa or the experimental side, but just the sort of tinkling classical side that you might hear on parts of Uncle Meat, say. Excellent band from Canada. This is on the EMI Harvest label from 1975. And this is also from 1975. We've been to the far-off land of Canada and the far-off land of Virginia and the far-off land of Saturn. This is from the far-off land of Germany. Volenstein, the symphonic rock orchestra as they are billed. It's a bit of an overstatement in more than one way. Stories, songs, and symphonies. Main guy in Volenstein was Jürgen de Lasse. He claimed to be a descendant of the 17th century German military leader after whom the band was named, Albrecht von Wallenstein. I think that was just an excuse for him to pose in period costume for publicity photos. Nowadays, I understand he is a food critic and no longer making prog rock albums. This is not all that symphonic or even prog. It's a more mainstream rock album, but pretty good. And it's a German band, but this pressing is on the Italian PDU label with that great Cosmic Couriers label design, Die Kosmische Kurierin. Kuriera. And yesterday I was in the record store, and one thing I was looking for was Todd Rundgren's album, Faithful, which is the album where on one side he does note-for-note recreations of famous 60s pop hits by the Beatles and the Yardbirds and the like. I didn't find that, but I did pick up a copy of Utopia, Deface the Music. And this is an album where he doesn't cover Beatles songs, but the entire album is pastiches of the Beatles sound, going in a kind of chronological order. So the first tracks sound very much like the early Beatles, and as it goes on, we get songs that resemble the likes of, there's a very I Am the Walrus type sound on, I think, the last track. There's a little Penny Lane kind of sound in there, a little Sgt. Pepper. But a very nice tribute to the Beatles. This is from 1980. And it is complete with the inner sleeve advertising other Utopia albums. It's kind of like the Ruddles without the comedy. Picked up this album, still in the shrink of Tom Rapp and Pearls Before Swine. Actually leaving it in the shrink because I don't think I'm even going to keep this one. I don't really like this album very much. The cover fools me, actually, because it very much resembles an earlier Pearls Before Swine album, These Things Too, which has a similar graphic layout with the big white border and a classical artwork, in that case portraying Jesus in the middle. And that's an album I quite like. This one, not so much. It doesn't have the weirdness of earlier Pearls Before Swine. It's just Thomas Rapp and his wife Elizabeth and a lot of hired session men making a more polished sound than the older Pearls Before Swine. And without that weirdness and the kind of bizarre, almost sort of like I would compare the older Pearls Before Swine to something like Incredible String Band, where you've got people who are playing instruments that they're not all that adept at just because they'll, throw anything into the mix for the sake of music and make a good go of it. This, you've got people who can really play their instruments, and the results are a guy with a strange voice backed up by slick session men, and it's just sort of an ordinary folk rock sound. There's some good points to it, but like I say, it just doesn't thrill me that much. So this one's not really a keeper. This is from 1971. For something completely different, Karlheinz Stockhausen. I've often shown his albums. This is one I didn't have before, Mantra, performed by the dual pianist brothers Alois and Alphonse Kontarski. This is a work for two pianos, and it's based on, as the title suggests, a repeating theme, a mantra, which consists of the 12 notes of the chromatic scale followed by a repeat of the first note. So it's a 13-note theme. And the pianos are electronically modified by ring modulators. And what a ring modulator is it's a device that takes an input signal and compares it to an internal oscillator signal and outputs the sum and difference frequencies between the input and the internal tone. The pianists are instructed to tune their ring modulators to the keynote, the starting and ending note, so that when that note is played, the note sounds fairly pure, but the farther they get away from that note, the more distortion is created by running it through the ring modulator. And to tell the truth, I can't really tell that that's what's happening on this album. I can't even really hear the degree to which it's all based on the 13-note theme in various transpositions and reversals and inversions. It's all very dynamic. A lot is happening, very colorful, pianistically. So it's great listening. I don't really get the structure, but, you know, if you did, I think that structure sounds a little dry, and it might be kind of a less interesting thing if it were more plain that that's what's going on. It's kind of unusual to have a gatefold on one of these Deutsche Grammophon releases. There you are. And of course, this is a sort of graphic version of the motto or mantra that the piece is based on. Some more electronic music from Lisa Belladonna, great exponent of the Moog synthesizer, Appalachian Wilderness. This is an album that she recorded a couple of years back in April of 2019. This vinyl release just came out. It's on red vinyl. I actually had pre-ordered this, so it just arrived about a week ago. And Lisa Belladonna's music is very much in the vein of classic Berlin School electronics. So if you like Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze, this is very much in your wheelhouse. It's a great record of that kind of flowing, sequencer-driven electronics. It has some nature sounds mixed in. Conceptually, it's based on Native American lore and a sacred river of Indian tradition. Lisa Belladonna plays Moog synthesizers and sequencers, ARP 2600, Mellotron, organ, ARP string ensemble, polymoog, reel-to-reels, gongs, chimes, and bells. And we get a nice little glam shot of the lady herself on the insert, along with notes about the Cherokee legend on which the music is based, or by which it was inspired. Onto the symphonic repertoire. Camille Saint-Saëns, French composer, and his last symphony of three, the Organ Symphony. The organ was not traditionally part of the symphonic tradition at this time, which was the 1880s when this was recorded. No, it was not recorded in the 1880s. It was composed in the 1880s. It's performed here by the powerhouse organist E. Power Biggs and Eugene Ormandy conducting the Philadelphia Orchestra. What I was trying to say was the organ is not usually included in or alongside the symphony orchestra at that time, so that was a bit of an innovation, and it is a very powerful, there's that word again, sound that Saint-Saëns gets with this combination, and indeed this combination of musicians gets with that combination. Another oddity of this symphony is that instead of the conventional four-movement structure, which had been traditional for a long time for symphonies, it's only two movements. In this case, 19 minutes and 14:25, but they are divided up into, not movements, but sections of each movement are separate enough that you can hear, well, this is the part that might correspond to a movement of a classical symphony. I've shown music of Anton Bruckner before, usually accompanied by a talk about what a perv he was, but this is his Symphony No. 5, double LP, again on Deutsche Grammophon. And there is no organ in this work, but Bruckner was an organist, and you can really hear in this a lot of music that you say, yeah, this was written by an organist. I could really hear this being played on an organ, but here it's scored out for strings or it's scored out for brass, but you can definitely hear the mind of an organist behind this. And he was a perv, More symphonies, more symphonies. The Danish composer Carl Nielsen in 2 symphonies, the Symphony No. 4, The Inextinguishable, and the Symphony No. 5, which doesn't have a nickname. The Symphony No. 4 is a 4-movement symphony, but the movements are performed without any pause, so it's meant to just go by like one piece. So like Saint-Saëns, he was sort of struggling with the convention that a symphony had 4 separate movements. So it stopped, and then you had another movement, then it stopped, and then you had another. And Saint-Saëns had the 2-movement idea. Here he just takes the 4 movements and blends them all together. On the 5th, he does the same thing Saint-Saëns does. He did only 2 movements, but with multiple sections or regions within each movement. And both of these symphonies have features for the percussionists. In the case of the 4th symphony, it's the timpani. Very prominent role for the timpani. And in the final movement, a second timpanist is added, and they have a duel. And on this recording by Max Rudolph conducting the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, it's nicely placed in the stereo. So you've got a left timpani and a right timpani, and the 2 players are just really hashing it out and having a battle. So if you're into dueling timpani, this is the symphony for you. And this recording is on the Deca label. It's unusual to see classical music on Deca in the US. I associate Deca with the British releases of the material that was released in the USA under the London imprint. So that's the No. 4. And the No. 5 features a prominent part for the snare drummer in the 1st movement. And the 4th symphony, The Inextinguishable, that was written during World War I. This was written in the aftermath exactly 100 years ago. So this was written in 1922, or completed in 22. And the drummer is given the license to improvise. And that's not something that was really done in those days. So that was quite an innovation, to give the drummer instructions simply to go ape and cover up the orchestra at this one point when he's playing a free-form cadenza. He's supposed to just break the music into pieces by playing some shattering improvised solo. And this is an original 1960 pressing of this recording by Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic. And as you can see, it's a demonstration, not for sale copy. And like so many records I pick up from this store in their classical bin, it's got these dates penciled in by some previous, apparently, disc jockey from a classical radio station that I assume represent when the record was played over the years. Music of Olivier Messiaen, French 20th century composer. Music inspired by birds, as you might guess from this kind of Maltese falcon-looking guy on the cover. There are 3 pieces on here: Oiseaux exotiques, or exotic birds, La Bouscale, which is the name of a type of bird, I forget what type it is, and Réveil des Oiseaux, or the bird's awakening, or dawn of the bird, something I think. Czech Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Václav Neumann, and piano by Mrs. Messiaen, Yvonne Loriot. Messiaen was fascinated by birds and inspired by birds. And the songs of birds are translated as best they can be to our tuned instruments using the Western chromatic scale. And woven all through these pieces, you can really hear the imitations of bird song all through this, particularly coming from the piano and from the woodwinds. One more from the classical world, and good old Johann Sebastian Bach. We're back to the world of the organ, and in this case, Virgil Fox with his heavy organ. Virgil Fox in the 70s toured rock venues with a touring Rogers electronic organ and proselytized to the unwashed hippies for the music of Bach. And he was a very flamboyant Liberace type character. He might come out in, a suit with sequins, just like Liberace. And between the performances, he would just sermonize. And he was just like an evangelist talking about Jesus when he talked about Bach. He would just get the crowd up with his inspirational speeches about Bach. When I was in high school, in fact, this was like my first real date. I took the girl to a Virgil Fox concert it was right around the time this album, Bach Live in San Francisco, was recorded in Winterland. This was released in 1972. Show we saw was at San Diego State University Outdoor Amphitheater, and I think the program consisted of 6 pieces by Bach, and then he did 5 encores on top of that. Virgil Fox, quite the character. Carla, Tropic Appetites. This is a great album of Carla Bley's compositions based on the poetry of Paul Haynes. Awesome lineup. Julie Tippett's doing most of the vocals, of course formerly known as Julie Driscoll, back in the Brian Auger and the Trinity Swingin' London days. Unidentified Cat on saxophone. Oh, I should have saved that for last. I'll save that for last. Howard Johnson on voice, reeds, and tuba. David Holland on bass and cello, Michael Mantler on trumpet, Tony Marcus on violin, Carla Bley on voice, piano, keyboards, marimba, and so on, Paul Mochian on drums, not listed on the back, guest vocalist Karen, a very young Karen Mantler, who would grow up and look just like her mom and tell us all about her cat Arnold. And speaking of cats, there is that unidentified cat who, in fact, is shown here, so we can see that he's a cat in the hat. And that cat blows the most fiery saxophone you ever heard on the lengthy opening track of this. This is, most of the pieces here are vocal, based on the Haynes poetry, but the first piece is a lengthy instrumental titled What Will Be Left Between Us and the Moon Tonight? And that unidentified cat boy, he's a real gato. Yes, he's a gato. And maybe unidentified in Spanish is Barbieri, because that's who is just blowing his heart out on that track. Ronald Shannon Jackson and the Decoding Society. Decode Yourself. This is terrific. This is fiery stuff. This is funk, avant-garde, composed, not really free, but very out jazz. Electric jazz, electronic jazz. There's synthesizers. Vernon Reid is on guitar, and he is awesome. You've also got 2 bassists, Reverend Bruce Johnson and Melvin Gibbs on bass, Eric Person on saxophones, Robin Eubanks on trombone, Akbar Ali on violin, Vernon Reid on guitar, and guitar synthesizer and banjo, Onaje Allen Gums on synthesizer, and of course Ronald Shannon Jackson himself on the drums. This is hot stuff, very powerful, very dynamic, and very fun. Finally, a music with no instruments on it. Songs of the Humpback Whale. This was a very popular album in the 70s, sort of a traditional accompaniment to one's hippie pad, and it is just like what it says on the title. It's the sounds of whales singing under sea, recorded as best they could. They couldn't keep out all the sounds of the boat itself and the waves, but that obviously adds greatly to the ambience. The guy who sold this to me yesterday said that he had played it in the store and that was an eerie experience. I recently showed a Johannes album that includes his composition And God Created Great Whales, which includes whale songs much like what we hear here. And that is even mentioned obliquely in the liner notes that folk singers have begun to sing about whales. Works of orchestral music have been composed with whale songs. That's Johannes. This was another bargain bin find. I already had this on CD, but it's just fun to have the record as it appeared in the 70s. So that's all. Thank you very much for watching. Be well. Talk with you again soon. Bye-bye for now.